This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. We're getting a little bit closer to that time frame. If this actually goes down as planned, by August, people will be fully vested in the fact that the NBA has resumed the 2019-2020 NBA season with hopefully a means to getting to an end, which means crowning a possible champion. Now, who knew that 4 months ago we would have even been contemplating whether or not there may be a season ahead? But hey, leave it to the NBA, leave it to the Players Association, leave it to the players trying to find a pathway forward in order to make this happen. But let that not be said that things have still been going on. And hopefully we've been doing our part to be able to keep that in its proper focus. But let's start talking about some basketball again as well too, right? So let me go ahead and roll out the red carpet to my right-hand man, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my man, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Holla back at me, Mr. Shaw. Have you been dreaming, or are we waking up to some kind of reality that basketball may be played in a month's time?
So I think the most interesting part about this week's show is that we're going to be talking about those teams that are actually not returning to the court, no matter what happens, in some capacity. But overall, it is great to be talking about NBA basketball, and kind of focusing our attention to what's happening in and around the league on a more positive side of things.
Yeah, but I didn't want us to roll into not, like we were trying to ease people into this. Now we've already just killed off like what? There's 22 teams that are going to participate. So that leaves a whopping 8 that are going to be like heavily angry at us because we're already ready to roll out the eulogies. I mean, I know everybody loves, this part of our show sometimes when we do the autopsy reports, but let it not be said that the whole intent or the idea is that we wanted to start talking about some basketball, right?
Absolutely. Our guys, Slick Partner and people like that, they're ready to have their hand on the detonator for some of these things. But the one interesting caveat about, I think, even going into the autopsy reports is a lot of it is still going to be unknown as a result of what teams, even now that are not going to be playing, they have more options once they know other teams are done for the regular season or for even after the playoffs. So, especially when it comes to trades and options and free agents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a great time to at least get the conversation going and to start to think about what teams could potentially be thinking about as the season resumes and then eventually comes to a close in sometime in October.
Absolutely. So over the next few weeks, while we're, kind of inching ourselves a little bit closer to the restart of the 2019-2020 NBA season, and definitely our attention is going to be focused on the teams that will be participating to, finalize and eventually lead and path forward to whoever may be a possible champion for this season. We can't forget about the other teams that participated in this season prior to the pandemic and what their future is going to look like moving forward. And, while we do our little thing, put our little spin on how we interpret these teams' season, they are still going to have an impact when this season ends on what other teams may be looking to do, whether it's transactional or it's even just from a free agency perspective or even from a coaching or an operational perspective. There will be some movement going on, and we got to talk about these teams nevertheless. So we will be doing our coveted autopsy reports covering teams that won't be participating in this year's in the rest of the season, but obviously we want to take a look back on what the season meant to them and what their path moving forward should look like. As always, we appreciate those who are hopping on board with us here on the Baseline NBA podcast. Be sure to get at my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA or get at me at Game Face Lee. The show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. As always, whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts, add the Baseline NBA podcast to your playlist. Kick back, relax, and allow us to continue to keep rolling out this awesome content that covers the NBA. Without further ado, you know how we roll, autopsy report style, here on The Breakdown. Time to break it down.
Break it down to the bone gristle.
They're dead. Wait, who's dead? My team is dead! They knew we were coming, man. They knew we were coming. They're dead! They're all dead!
Cal Lee Warrenshaw, Baseline NBA podcast, and we are back with another edition of the Autopsy Reports, where we basically put them on the slab and, we try and diagnose what came of the 2019-2020 season and what may need to happen moving forward into the 2020-21 season. And we're going to start off, with the team that we've been doing this Autopsy Reports quite often, and maybe, too much so, when we talk about an organization that just, if not for the luck of the draft, we really don't know how long this ineptitude and lack of identity will continue to hamper a team like the Cleveland Cavaliers. And the reason why I start off with this intro on this show is because I think this is exactly what it comes down to. This is a team that finished 19-46. And for me, one word to sum up the season of the Cavs is skittish. I just feel like once we start talking about the Cleveland Cavaliers, you have no idea if you're a vehicle on the road. You have no idea once you get on that road with the Cleveland Cavaliers, what direction your car is going to turn. I mean, it can either stay on the straight path or that sucker can skid right off on the road, or heaven forbid there's a cliff where your car might wind up ending, or where you might wind up ending, but your car winds up ending in a different direction. To me, when I think of the Cleveland Cavaliers, I think of a team and an organization that has had a skittish season. And I know we're going to break all that stuff down, but I was curious from your perspective, what would be one word you can think of when you talk about the Cleveland Cavaliers?
I would go with your word, and maybe just if I was going to change it a little bit, I'd just say unstable. A lot of that too comes from the changes in the front office and how Beeline didn't work out to begin with. The issues with Kevin Love and, was he happy? Did he want to be here? Did he not want to be there? Was Colin Sexton being too aggressive, as a point guard and not trying to get others involved? Darius Garland struggling a little bit, even having some injuries. It's just they were an unstable team and unstable franchise for the majority of the season, especially trying to mix the young and the old, if you will, or let's say the young and the experienced. And that just was not a mix that worked well for the course of the season. And they have a lot of figuring out to do when it comes to the direction that they want to go. But I'd say for sure, this team has been unstable.
You bring up a really interesting point, because I want to focus some of this attention on Kevin Love. Kevin Love has been outspoken regarding his mental health issues. And I don't even like the word issues. I would probably say the symptoms that he's exhibited and his concerns regarding his mental health and stability has been well noted and well documented. And I think it highlights an important point, Shaw, when we talk about how organizations have to start adopting a different model. You wonder whether or not, and I'm not putting this on the Cleveland Cavaliers, I'm not saying it's their fault, but I will say that guys like Kevin Love, guys like DeMar DeRozan, whom at some point we're going to talk about him when we talk about the San Antonio Spurs. This is another outlying factor in their decision making about the organizations and the teams they want to play for. I think they want to be in an environment that harnesses them to feel better about their status, their condition. Sometimes it's not about the money. Sometimes it's not about financial stability. It could be about mental health, mental stability, the kind of coaches that are talking to them, the kind of teammates that they're surrounded by, the environment, the community in which they have to live and exist, whether it be for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, or so forth and so on. And I don't know what is driving Kevin Love's possible decision-making process, because obviously when he signed to this deal, I think he signed recognizing playing next to a great player like LeBron James and then an equally talented player like Kyrie Irving. He wants to win, and maybe winning helped quell down a lot of the depression that he suffered, playing in Minnesota and going through what he's been through over the years of his basketball career. But I think it opens up a very interesting point when we're talking about how from top to bottom organizations need to start really focusing and looking at what they're doing on their part to accommodate talented players and what they're prioritizing as a means for them to go out there and perform at the highest level and also help these teams win basketball games.
I mean, I think what I'll touch on with that is that Cleveland at first didn't recognize or didn't know the signs, and Love, as kind of was his right, was trying to keep some of those things private. But as it bubbled over, however it was, I guess a year or two ago now, they have now since, I think, tried to right the course in the sense of trying to make sure that he is supported in the way that he needs to be supported. And, shouts to Love for what he's been able to do. I think he just won an ESPY, recently for his work in the mental health space and trying to get and inspire others and not just, not just players, but people and fans and kids and the whole nine. He's been a great advocate for that. And I think when it comes to, the organizational culture, you want to have some semblance of stability. Of course, you want to win, but you at least want to make sure that you're going in the right direction, right? And I think all those things can contribute to a negative atmosphere if it's the adverse of that. And I think with Love, whatever happened this year, we don't know enough to know if it spoke to his, his mind state, if you will, so to speak. But in general, the losing and the coaching and maybe again some of the younger players, maybe that bubbled over. He since apologize or righted course, and he and Colin Sexton specifically are in a good space. Remember, we had Spencer Davies on, in the middle of the season to kind of talk about the Beeline thing and everything that was going on with the Cavaliers. But I think a lot of where Cleveland is going now is going to be dependent on what Bickerstaff ultimately wants to do. And I'll go ahead and kind of dive into the overall team structure, so to speak, is they have three young guys that they're trying to build around. So Sexton, you have Garland, and you have Kevin Porter Jr. I remember when we had Spencer on, he more or less said Porter Jr. is probably the highlight guy of those three that they're most focused on. So where does that leave Kevin Love, who we all know they've been since trying to trade and trying to move on? They still have to figure out something with Tristan Thompson. And Andre Drummond has more or less said he's coming back at his $28 million a year. So that more or less leaves a hole where they have to figure out Love and Thompson. I think you can get Thompson back at a decent number, maybe 3 years, 30 million or something like that. And maybe that's too much, I think, maybe for some Cav fans to pay. But can you get an acceptable haul for Love? And I don't know what you ultimately want to do there, because you don't really want a lot of veterans, so to speak, because you're not quite there yet. I'm going to use an old adage, like they're 2 years away. You just don't want them to be 2 years away from being 2 years away. And I think they have got to figure out a way to build through Garland, Sexton, and Porter Jr., more importantly, and figure out, again, what they're going to do with that power forward spot between Love and Thompson.
Well, but I also will then pivot to this part of this, Shaw, when we're talking about the importance of Kevin Love. When you're saying that they want a haul, they're looking for something specific, under what premise are they selling the idea that their expectations of getting something significant back for Kevin Love allows them the latitude to continue to keeping him hanging on, or hanging on to him, excuse me, is a better way to phrase it, hanging on to him without compromising whatever future you're trying to build with the combination of Sexton, Porter, and now with Drummond, right? Like, because he's planning to exercise his option. If you want to believe in the idea that there's some kind of future with this tandem of these guys, and maybe even having Tristan Thompson, I mean, you can't have all three of those dudes. But if you're going to believe in getting Thompson at the expense of knowing you can give away Kevin Love, I'm just wondering, what kind of expectations are you really saying that you're giving yourself, knowing that Kevin Love's ability to play and his numbers be impactful have to mean something more than just the Cavs knowing that they have him at, and they're dangling him as a carrot to get something in return.
Yeah, and I think those are conversations that are the hardest to have, I think, for this Cleveland organization right now, because he is 31. He's got whatever it is, $90 million left on his deal, and he doesn't play great defense. So yes, he's a great rebounder. He can still shoot the three. He can still score between 17 to 21 points a game, as long as he's healthy. But there's also that he's had the back issues, and the presumable suitors, like a Portland that has been rumored, in years past, and Boston, I think, is out of those conversations now when it comes to Love. But could you figure out a way to get a Zach Collins back, with draft picks and things if Portland feels like, hey, Love is the missing piece to what we're trying to ultimately do? And you just have to wait to kind of see how desperate maybe another team is to want to take on, number one, that contract. But number two, again, all the baggage that kind of comes along with Love, especially when it comes to his injury history. And I think in those aspects, that's where Cleveland is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And that's why, while I think it's hard to move that contract, if you're ultimately not able to do it, then you lose out on a guy like Tristan Thompson, because there's just no reason, as you alluded to bring all of them back, because they all can't play. Because remember, they still have Larry Nance Jr. as well. Like, Larry Nance is there and is clamoring to get some playing time, and is a guy who can play some defense, is expanding his range now to be able to shoot the three balls too. So they did have too many bigs that don't really fit to the sum of their parts. I'll counter all of that by saying is, again, if you feel like they're 2 years away, well, Drummond's deal is 1 more year. So he's like, you can suffer through, I don't want to, maybe that's the wrong terminology to use, but it's like, all right, you bite the bullet and he has $28 million left, and that's going to free up that. And then you see what you're able to do outside of Andre Drummond after next year as well. So they have a couple of different directions they can go, because they're not quite there yet. And I don't think they're willing to take on a bad deal. They're not going to want to give up draft picks in addition to getting rid of Kevin Love. They're going to want to get draft picks for Kevin Love, that they can maybe ultimately pivot to somebody else. As I said, I think they're just really in a mixed spot right now between trying to develop their young talent, but what is the right mix of veteran talent that they can bring in alongside those guys to help them win. And it seemed to prove this year that Love wasn't it. And as, again, I keep referencing Spencer Davies when he was on our show, he said Tristan was more the guy, like who kind of just bucked up and wanted to be that veteran locker room leader. So that's where I think they're going to have to ultimately come to some sort of decision.
You bring up a lot of interesting points. So let me try and run through a couple of these, because I do want to kind of dig into a little bit. I think it's going to help us segue into something that I've noticed more about what this season is represented for the Cleveland Cavaliers from a statistical perspective. But let me highlight a couple of important things that you were just talking about a moment ago. If you are the Cleveland Cavaliers, I understand that, like in any situation like what's going on with Kevin Love and his contract, that the idea is that you're trying to get something back. But just from my observation, right, I don't have all of the numbers. I mean, I wish I had that kind of time to be able to kind of dig in and really provide some hard, analytical evidence to this. But I've more so have found that when teams feel like the first inclination in having a player who has an exorbitant contract, right, and the intent is that you're trying to move him, either, you're moving him for money, or you're moving him for picks, or you're moving him for a marquee player in some picks, because the player that they're looking at may not, have a contract value the same, whatever the case may be. I often feel like most of these organizations continue to hurt themselves, because if what you're telling me is that it's important for them to get picks, then what is that saying about the already 3-4 players that they have drafted, put on this roster? To your point, they need to coach up and develop. How much emphasis and energy is being put forth on those guys who are supposed to be homegrown, right? This is a reflection of how you assess talent as it pertains to what kind of system these guys are playing on, and so forth and so on. That your intention has to be that you have to get more draft picks for whoever it is that you're giving up. And I often find at times, especially this situation with Kevin Love, is a perfect example of that. If you're high on guys like Colin Sexton and Kevin Porter Jr., things of that nature, then I don't know how many more draft picks you actually feel is necessary for you to have, right? And I understand that part of it may be for the future, so you can stash away, so maybe you can trade to get another superstar player once you figure. But my thing is that the more you keep bringing on draft picks, the more you oversaturate the value of that within your own organization. It makes it counterproductive when you realize that the talent that you already have drafted have not played to the level that you've hoped for. And then you lose on both fronts. So it's just interesting, because this is what continuously keeps happening with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And the perfect example of that is Tristan Thompson. While Tristan Thompson is a solid player, he was a lottery draft pick, came along with Kyrie Irving. And you can clearly see the trajectory for both of these players. If you really look at it, Tristan Thompson would be a marginalized role player. He would not be starting with a lot of other teams, right? So at what point do you as an organization start realizing that you can continue to keep asking for draft picks, but if you're drafting players that you have these high hopes on, you're not even coaching and developing them for them to have the added value, then what is bringing on more picks going to do? And what does that look like to a fan who's trying to see whether you're in the stages of rebuild or you're actually putting together a sustainable team that will compete each and every single year?
Right, and I think those are great points, and that's what I'm saying. I think with Cleveland, it's understanding what the market can yield if a Love trade were to avail itself, and that's what I'm saying. It may not. It just may not be there. For them, they need pretty much everything. They need shooting, they need defense. A hell of a lot of defense. And so I think the best thing that they could hope for right now, if they were to be able to move Love, is maybe a developing power forward who's kind of like maybe a 3-and-D type guy, so to speak, and then maybe a couple of collection of younger picks, future picks that they would hopefully potentially try to move. Your point about development, I think, is interesting because that's where they have traditionally struggled, right? And part of what this whole Cavaliers team is an organization been about, especially post LeBron and now even post Kyrie, is trying to create some sort of stable structure. And now they still
post
have that
LeBron
in
1 or post LeBron 2?
LeBron
okay, but yeah, I was about to say, take your pick about how many times they've gone back to the lab in order to try to make this experiment work. So
right, but I think with Bickerstaff now and being the guy, we joked about him not having the interim tag, and now he's going to be the guy at least presumably for the next few years. Then that allows them to build some semblance of a culture, and then he can try to figure out exactly what you said. Can he coach up these young guys? What Sexton is in year 2 going into year 3. Garland's going into year 2 and Porter's going to year 2. So I think they still have a lot more they need to see with this team. They're not gonna Victor Oladipo this and trade those guys off right away, like Orlando did. I think they're gonna want to see it out, but they really just have to see what the market yields. And if it doesn't yield anything, then you don't do a stupid move. You keep Love, until maybe he does become a little bit more palatable to a team that feels like they're desperate, so to speak. But I think the most interesting thing about all of that is that what ends up happening with Tristan Thompson in the meantime. And like I said, if it's a matter of just waiting Drummond out, or if you feel like you go into next year and then somewhere around the trade deadline, someone feels like, hey, you know what, there's a better position for me. And you know how it always goes around this time. And he'll be like, all right, well, I'm looking at a team where I can go and potentially win. So does that team get that guarantee that Drummond would eventually sign? Said we're looking at all types of scenarios for Cleveland ultimately. But I think the most important thing to think about is like they're not ready to win just yet. And no matter what happens next year, this is still going to be a team in some sort of transition, trying to build around the young talent and maybe some of the talent they've already had and accumulated in the years past.
But even if that's the case, Shaw, and I think this leads into the next question. So one of the things I think was that it is very important to bring up is if you look at this Cavaliers team, while they were not the worst team, they don't have the worst record in the NBA. Their statistics don't marry with what the record reflects. And I think maybe just having a couple of veteran players like Kevin Love, Tristan Thompson, Larry Nance Jr., having at one point Jordan Clarkson, having a couple of veteran players has helped stave the ugliness or the stench that would carry this Cavaliers team if this whole season played itself out, right? And so part of that point that you're saying is, looking for certain players, right, to help fill in voids and gaps. And I think that's going to be another ongoing question that is going to continue to drag this perception about whether or not this team in 2 years is going to be where they are for 2 years, right? And it's going to be an infinite question mark with them because it just doesn't seem like unless your initials are LBJ, they have no commitment to the players that they have on their roster. I don't know what their commitment is to Colin Sexton. I don't know what their commitment is to Kevin Porter Jr. There's a big line question here, Shaw. Do you believe in Colin Sexton as your point guard? Not as your star player, but as your point guard, right? Do you believe that the backcourt combination of Sexton and Porter Jr. can be a backcourt for the future? Who wants to be the 2? who wants to be the primary ball handler? Who's going to get that ball to Drummond or to Thompson or to Love, whoever you're deciding to keep on the roster? And I think that whether you have JB Bickerstaff on there or not, this is always going to be the running question because of who they're drafting and what their intentions are moving forward with the team. Now, if it's because you have JB Bickerstaff and he believes that the best way forward for this team is Colin Sexton running the point, then I think a lot of these questions can be answered, and there should be a full-fledged commitment in making sure that he is that guy, like the Chris Paul, that guy that's going to help move that ball forward for this basketball team. But if you still have, doubts about what's going on here, then it doesn't matter how many players you throw out, how many players you bring back in. It's still going to come down to who is carrying the mantle for this basketball team. Who is going to attach, who is JB Bickerstaff going to attach himself with to the hip and say the reflection of this basketball team is with these said players. And I think that, to me, going into this season is going to be the bigger question. Not even whether or not this team rebuilds, but who really wants to identify them donning and wearing that Cavalier jersey, because they are on the clock.
So it's great that you brought it up that way, because what I like about the Cleveland Cavaliers situation, and even what you just said more pointedly, is because of the unknowns, you just don't know like how married they are to anything. And and again, I don't want to contradict myself per se. It's like, all right, well, they're not going to give up on certain guys right away, but I guess it depends what comes calling or what becomes available. If someone says, hey, well, we'll take Love, but you got to give us Sexton or you got to give us Garland. All right, well, what are we getting back, right? I don't think those guys are untouchable in any situation right now. I remember when Spencer Davis was on the show as well, too. There's a lot of conversation coming out of Cleveland that what Sexton would be best served as a backup point guard, kind of as a fire starter off the bench, guy who comes in here and gets you buckets because he's not a traditional point guard looking to get other people involved. There's a lot of different ways this team can go. And the combination of Sexton and Garland specifically are supposed to be their new age, Dame and CJ, and they're a long way away from that. And I think a lot of people in Cleveland, what's all right, they were a little bit hysterical trying to make some of those comparisons to begin with. The only thing that I know that seems to be pretty certain about this team is that they do like Kevin Porter and the growth he's shown over the course of his rookie year. Then he got hurt, and that kind of got stopped a little bit. So that's the one guy I don't think they're really trying to try to do much with right now. And again, Garland only had the 1 year, same thing like Porter, but I just don't know. He's just one of those guys that kind of fell to them in the draft. They're like, all right, we'll take a shot and see if we can create this, Dame and CJ backcourt type of situation. But your point about Sexton in general is very, very valid and makes a lot of sense, especially with the direction this team may ultimately decide to go. I don't think they're untouchable.
Do you know who Sexton eerily reminds me of? Which is why, they say, learn your history or you're doomed to repeat it. Sexton reminds me of like Kyrie Irving. I'm not saying he is as dynamic a player as Kyrie Irving, but what I'm saying is that Colin Sexton's trajectory eerily reminds me of Kyrie Irving after LeBron James left. And I'm just wondering, if you are the Cavaliers organization, you just lived through this. This isn't something that happened 10 years ago, Shaw. This is within the last 6 years, right? Like, if you just lived through this within 10 years, you just live within a decade. You've already lived this nightmare out. You know what I'm saying? And just by quote unquote the grace of God, LeBron James decides to come back and save you, right? But not because it was a question of whether or not the organization needs saving. It was a question of the city needing saving. And I'm just wondering, is that the lasting legacy that's going to be held about you repeating the same thing in the way that you're developing or the way that you're investing in Colin Sexton's future? Because he just reminds me of the way they handled Kyrie Irving.
I think with Sexton, a lot of what happens or has happened in the wake of Kyrie, so to speak, to try to expand on that comparison just slightly, it would just be about that there was just the team was devoid of talent. So Kyrie kind of just went wild. Like they were clearly trying to build around him. He was a number one pick. Like that's what they were trying to do.
He was the show for them, right? He was the reason that they could validate charging what they charge for fans and fans coming to the arenas to see, because he helped wash away any perception that winning actually mattered. You know, and I'm not saying that to say that they don't care. I'm just saying that this is what you do. If you're not going to put together a team that can compete, you know, with any of the other teams in that period of the Central Division. I mean, look, the Milwaukee Bucks were not relevant at that time. It was the Chicago Bulls. So, you know, my whole thing is, it's like, look, even in the Eastern Conference, when that was a period of which the Eastern Conference was somewhat, they were relevant, but they weren't as dominant, right? Because LeBron James was there and he figured out a way, you know, to put everything down in Miami. You could make the argument that if the Cavaliers knew what they were doing and did it right, they wouldn't have completely lost a step. You know, they wouldn't have been a top 3 team like they would be year in, year out, having LeBron James. But they could have easily been a basketball team that would have been in the middle, lower end, and consistently making the playoffs if you have that talented of a player in Kyrie Irving. But that wasn't the organization's priority after LeBron James left.
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother thing in some
I
ways.
know. We can spend another 30 minutes or to an hour talking about that. But that is my perception of that. Yeah.
Generational talent like that and expect to be all right. I think, again, with Sexton, why it's not translating as well is because they're not, in some ways, they're not as destitute as they were once LeBron left the first time. So LeBron left and then Kyrie came, right? So that's a completely different scenario. And I think with this team now, Sexton came and there were still guys like Love and some others who felt like, hey, I have some swag too, and I can help lead. Maybe Young Buck, you want to kind of earn your time a little bit. But I think we're past some of that part of their rebuilding, if you will, in terms of understanding or trying to get Sexton to be a certain thing. I think they have a handle on that now. The question just is, do they want to continue to build around that with what he is? And that's the part that I think is still very, very much up in the air. We haven't even talked about a guy like Dante Exum, who, while we don't expect him to be an impact player, but at least a guy who can come in, change the speed for you and play some defense, you know, at that point guard position as well. And I think that was a smart trade, you know, since they had to kind of get rid of Clarkson. It was a nice guy to maybe take a chance on here in general. But this roster has a lot of things that you're just not excited about, I think, especially when you get past, you know, the trio of Sexton, Garland, and Porter Jr. You know, you have Drummond, and it's just kind of a holdover here. Tristan is still a solid dude. We've talked about Love kind of ad nauseum, but Cedi Osman, you know, Zizic, guy, another big who hasn't really gotten much of a chance there. You know, Dylan Windler, like they just have a lot of mixed match pieces here that they still got to just try to develop, or then try to see what direction they ultimately want to go. And Bickerstaff hopefully will have the opportunity to do just that, you know, with Colby Altman leading the charge.
All right, well, now that you brought up Colby Altman leading the charge, before, you know, we kind of end this thing off and we bury the Cavs for the remainder of this season, I'm just curious from your perspective, Shaw, is Colby Altman on the clock?
I don't really think so. I mean, if I'm gonna, again, try not to contradict myself, if I feel like they're 2 years away, I think he's gonna get that time to try to build it out, and see how much progress they can make, you know, within that time with this core, or again, why not? Whether they try to make some big roster shakeups. Again, it's hard to talk about this stuff here in, you know, end of June, early July, when there's a lot that could happen over the course of the NBA season that is going to resume, and players and other things just become available to them that maybe they won't. I haven't even talked about what could potentially happen for them in the draft. You know, do they get lucky and get a high draft pick or whatever the case would be, and then try to package that with some of their players to try to make a splash right away. But to me, looking at it at face value, Colby Altman should be in here for kind of the long haul, looking to understand that, hey, my team is not ready just yet. We've got to build and try to build it the right way. And I think he's going to get the time, you know, from Gilbert and such to try to be able to do that over the next course 2 to 3 years.
My take from this is, I don't think Colby Altman is on the clock. I don't think that he is per se on the hot seat yet, but watch to see how warm the seat gets. If he does decide to make certain moves, and I think part of that is going to be what happens with either Kevin Love, Tristan Thompson, or if he chooses to do something with Andre Drummond. If Colby Altman shows signs of being an aggressive GM, a chance taker, like a Sam Presti, right? Or does he choose to play things safe, and it backfires against him? I think that this period with how he responds with JB Bickerstaff and the way that this team plays is going to be a barometer about what's going to happen. I will also add this is an important element as well too, because we've done the last couple of weeks on the importance of black athletes, their voice. We're talking about racial inequality, and we're also talking about opportunities and chances for black general managers or people, or the representation of black people being hired in management positions. I don't think Cleveland can afford pulling the trigger on nixing Kobe Altman just yet. I think that the temperature needs to come down some, because if that does happen, then it'll be re-highlighted again that, Dan Gilbert doesn't get it, that, the Cleveland organization doesn't get it. And, they are going to, take the ire or the fire, so to speak, in what's happening. But let this not be said. Kobe Altman has to be very careful on the way that he handles things. There's already this perception about the buddy system going on with the New York Knicks. And we'll talk about the New York Knicks down the road at some point when we do our autopsies on them. But this, again, can hold a negative impact on how it's perceived on the qualifications of black men or women holding general manager or upper management positions, and how they are not living up to that standard, which gives it viability to say, well, we should hire the white guy. I'm not making this a racial issue. What I'm saying is that this is part of the problem that exists in the perception when there is not a equitable representation of white hired general managers to black general managers and things of that nature. Every misstep is absolutely magnified and is going to be held to the next guy coming over on whether or not they're qualified, especially in a predominantly black sport like the NBA.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, and I think with Altman, he's been given an opportunity, and let me retract that. He's earned his opportunity to be where he's at.
He has.
And now he just got to. And yeah, he just got to earn his staying power like any other GM out there, in that type of role. But, hopefully, we see he and others like him succeed, so that there are more opportunities, for people of color when it comes to these executive and managerial type positions within teams and organizations.
All right. So now let's go ahead and transition. The second body that's on the slab for our autopsy report in this week's show. And we'll be talking about the Golden State Warriors. The team at that point leading up to the pandemic had the worst record in the NBA with a 15-50 record. And if there's one word that I can sum up for the Warriors season, Shaw, is woke. But if we wanted to add like extra letters to it, I would have been like woke AF. I'd add an AF to that. Okay. When you look at this Golden State Warriors basketball team, and listen, everybody is going to be talking about how hard they fell off in losing Kevin Durant. And, this team is just ravaged with injuries. And I'm sure maybe that might be the word you would use is just, it's a throwaway season because this team was ravaged with injuries from Jump Street. One of the things that I was talking about with the Cleveland Cavaliers in comparison to the Golden State Warriors is that when you look at the Warriors, as bad as a record it was, statistically, they were not reflective of how bad their record reflected. To me, statistically, they reflected exactly what a team looks like when they don't have their core pieces playing consistently through the course of an NBA season. And it lived itself out. Now, it definitely also exposed a lot of things that you want to see happen going into the season when the team is fully healthy. But for the most part, the Warriors actually found an opportunity to relitigate the conversation about will they resurrect their death by depth lineup. And we would only be able to see that unless they actually gave minutes to a lot of these young players who came out there and really held things together as best as they possibly could for Steve Kerr and the Golden State Warriors.
Yeah, I mean, my word, as you alluded to, would have been injured AF, right? Like that's truly what this team was
Nice.
throughout the entire
You can put a
season.
lot of AFs
Unfortunately,
at the ends of some one words if we were going to describe the Warriors season. Yes.
yeah, truly. I mean, those are big facts there. And the one thing about this season, positive lining, if you will, is you saw Steve Kerr's ultimate resolve. You learn if he's able to kind of coach up some young guys. And listen, the talent level still needs to be there, but they had some players had some remarkable stretches throughout the course of the season. Eric Pascal, even Kai Bowman at some point in the season was playing really great basketball as well too for them. They kind of pseudo rehabilitated Marquise Chris, who I know you don't love, but I mean he played well for them, especially down towards before the season ended, if you will. And those are things I
But he
think that
gets a
they can
bro
be
hug now from
encouraged
me.
about.
I can give him a bro hug because
Yeah,
he
I mean,
this season was a season of maturity for Marquise Chris, and he embraced it.
needed to be. Yeah,
He embraced it quite nicely, and I can appreciate the fact that he recognized the writing on the. And let's keep in mind, he was going through this while still competing, recognizing that your boy Willie Cauley-Stein was on that roster before he got moved, right? And he still became an important piece for the Warriors, regardless of what their record reflected. So I'm very proud of his maturation, and he deserves a bro hug from me. Can't love him just like that yet, but he deserves a bro hug.
So what will be interesting to see is just what they do with it next year. And they have so much money committed to Curry, Klay Thompson, Wiggins, and Draymond Green. There isn't jack left for anybody else. It really is supplemental parts. So they lucked out, and and again, let me give them credit. So I shouldn't say that they drafted well in getting Pascal, so he can now come in and be a bench guy for them next year, and be a good reserve role player for them. And chances are they're going to get a very high draft pick. So somebody else that Kirk can now help develop, and whoever that player turns out to be is going to get to be nurtured by three of the best guys in the NBA in Thompson, Draymond, and Curry, right? So those are some of the positive things about this team, and a lot of people, including myself, didn't necessarily want to write them off coming into the year, not knowing that Curry was also going to go down with an injury and that Draymond would struggle with injuries all throughout. The most interesting thing about this, though, is the integration and the full integration of Wiggins once everybody is back and presumably healthy. And I think that's where Kerr and this Golden State Warriors team is really going to have to understand, okay, what their new normal is, right? How can they integrate Wiggins? Is he a defensive guy, just a slasher, and you can get him to play defense on a regular basis, which he's been pseudo reluctant to do over the course of the course of his career, despite the physical gifts that he have. I think they have to get him to buy into that and let guys like Curry and Klay, do what they do best. I think if they're lucky enough to get a high draft pick, as I alluded to, and can get a center for them that really makes sense that they can build around, then this team is going to be pretty good next year and still be a formidable threat out there in the Western Conference. But again, it's all centers around their health, and then overall development of Curve with the young guys that they ultimately bring in.
There's so many ways to go from just what you just said. So let me stay on focus with this because you brought up Draymond Green a couple of times, and I got to ask you this question. If you can describe to me what Draymond Green's season was like in a sentence or two, what would be your interpretation of what we saw from Draymond Green?
Uninterested. I give it to you in one word. He wasn't interested. The minute Curry went down, he saw the writing on the wall, and I know he'll go out there and say he's a ultimate competitor and he never gives up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are points in the season, I think, when his competitiveness was challenged. So then you see him put together maybe a 2 or 3 game stretch. But ultimately, he was uninterested in the season because they didn't really have a chance at winning anything.
All right. So now, with that being said, if you are Draymond Green, right? Is he somebody that is a true leader or a true mouthpiece for this team moving forward?
I think, yeah, he's proven that. In past, I don't think that just goes away. Especially after one bad year. So I still think he's a big part of what they want to do on and off the floor. I think in trying to keep guys together within the locker room. I don't know how much you've paid attention, to some of his earlier comments once COVID started. He kind of relitigated that whole Kevin Durant thing. And while maybe some of that laundry didn't need to be aired, so to speak. If you're listening to him and if you believe him, he was a locker room glue. Like he really is that, and everybody
Right.
kind of on the
I'm
same
not
page.
questioning him not being a glue. I think when and maybe I have to put, what I mean by in true, because I often feel like from the outside, when you see Draymond Green characterize things the way that he does and says things, he's unfiltered. There's not, we've had a numerous amount of unfiltered players, but what we've never seen and we've never questioned is if whether or not that being unfiltered also translated into them not knowing how to properly communicate to key players on that team to go out and execute what's required. And we've talked up, right, about how Draymond Green has to be that guy. No Draymond Green meant they were not going to win that NBA championship back in 2016. Okay? They weren't winning that thing. All right? The moment he went down in game 5 is the moment we really questioned whether or not the Warriors were going to finish this thing out properly. And so I'm just saying, over the course of the last few years, what we're seeing is his numbers go down, but we never question the numbers because he does so many things. But now you have to wonder, is it more the talking that is taking away from our belief in his ability to be a true leader when necessary? Or does he need to be even more vocal? And when the guys do come back, how much of that will really have an impact on us centering around the importance that when you have a healthy Steph Curry, a healthy Klay Thompson, and even a healthy Draymond Green, because he was somewhat hampered this year, but when they're all collectively healthy and all of these elements that we're saying has made this a great team dynastically, if that's there, do we still see the same Draymond, or does that take a hit now?
I don't think him talking is ever going to go away. But to your point, maybe it's just the value, the integrity in those words, and does that start to dissipate at some point? But I think this upcoming season, and we're obviously a long way away from that, but just in general, what the Warriors are going to be looking to do is they're going to be looking for some semblance of redemption. And I think in that aspect, you can count on Draymond to be motivated. And I think in that aspect, you can count on Draymond's words not to fall hollow on anybody. Because this is going to be very much of like, oh, you forgot about us type season for Golden State, especially if everybody does come back and be healthy. And he's going to be on everyone's ass, including a guy like Wiggins, who they are going to want a lot out of. We've seen his numbers trend down. And as you alluded to, he's an intangibles guy. He's probably one of the most intangibles type player in the entire NBA. So the fact that he's at 8, 6, and 6, when he could have very easily been at probably 14, 15, 8 and 7 or something like that, had he not lost interest and had Curry not also got injured, that's kind of irrelevant at this point. We know that his overall contribution across the board statistically is going to be there, in moderate to decent, maybe even high numbers at times. But his impact on the intangible side and his impact in the locker room, with his words and with his leadership, is very much what Golden State still relies upon.
I will say this. I think this is the reason why I chose the word woke. Woke AF for this Warriors team. I love Steph Curry. I really do. I still think he has great years ahead of him, right? And whether or not it has to trend to him playing at an MVP-like kind of level, because I think the bar for MVP will be shifted again. But I really think that the true MVP for this team moving forward in this organization, it really comes down to the belief system, right? This is going to come down to what comes of Klay Thompson moving forward. Klay Thompson, to me, has the best opportunity and chance to snatch an MVP, depending on what the Warriors are doing and how Kerr cultivates this team, and regardless of what Draymond Green re-gives you. Klay Thompson, to me, has the best opportunity to play in the same way that we talk about Kawhi Leonard, in the same way that we talk about LeBron James. He can very much do that. It's difficult because everything is always being centered around Steph, and I'm not taking anything away from Steph, but I think that there is a opportunity here after this type of season happening that you can rechange that strategy and put the focus on, hey, Klay can give me 28, 30, and still be a staunch defender on some of the best opposition players, in the game. And that to me is a recipe for success, to be competing for a possible title each and every single year. Am I off on that thought?
Only part I'd say off on it is the points are there going to be there. The rebounding is going to, not necessarily the rebounding, but the defense is going to be there, presumably, coming back from an injury. Like, those are things we still need to wait to see to make sure he can come back. The difference, though, I think with that is because Curry's ability to create for himself and play make even for others is where Clay lacks. And that dimension of what Golden State does has made them so formidable for years. So I'm not going to just, relegate Clay to, hey, he's a spot-up shooter. But when you talk about guys who score 60 points off of 4 dribbles or whatever the hell it was, that kind of goes to show you, all right, he needs people to set him up, so to speak. And sure, he can post up every now and then, but again, that's posting up. He's not dribbling and initiating offense. At most, he may dribble off of a pick and roll and pull up, for the jumper, but he's not really doing a whole lot to create for others on that side of it. But if Clay can come back and again be as explosive offensively as he has been, that takes a lot of pressure off of everybody else, especially, he's 2 years younger than Steph as it is, and if he could come back, then that does make Golden State's overall prospect a lot better, especially even for a guy like, Wiggins as well too, who's going to be, again, kind of cutting and slashing. I'm sure he'll be working on his 3-ball, to kind of fit into this offense. But your point about Clay is very, very valid, but the playmaking part of it is where he still lacks. And if he's worked on that, he can do a little bit more off the bounce, then yeah, he really becomes a major problem that the league is going to have to try to figure out.
All right, so let's quickly transition to another part of this Warriors team that I think I'm looking forward to seeing this. We saw Eric Paschall really have a remarkable rookie season under the circumstances. And then as recently as a week ago or so in The Athletic, when asked about whether or not, Paschall is gonna have, what kind of role will he have going into this next season, he's saying, I know I'm going to take a lesser role. And he's indicated, I still feel like I'm going to make an impact because I feel like I've proven myself. I find that to be something interesting for a guy like Paschall, because he has a lot of athleticism to his game that could bode well for a team like the Golden State Warriors, right? And for him to dummy down a little bit the expectations that he can elevate his game to that next level and possibly even be as equal, if not as an important role for the Warriors in so many different ways, I think is opening up the question about, what are we expecting to see for this Warriors team other than our focus on the primary 3 and then Andrew Wiggins, because that's not going to be enough given how loaded not just the Western Conference is, but their own division is going to be. That you got a guy who's basically shooting around 56%, who gave you around 10, 12 points per game in this period. It'll be very interesting to see somebody telling me that he feels like he's going to wind up taking a lesser role. I think he's going to wind up having to take a big step forward, because we really still don't know about where Draymond is going to be health-wise. We don't know the status of the depth of that basketball team at the 3 possible 4 position. Paschall has shown that kind of versatility.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's probably an early candidate, for them. I'm not saying for the league, but he's going to be like their 6th man of the year, if you will, for that team. He's going to be the first guy off the bench, and somebody who can really do things, especially offensively. He's shown he can shoot the basketball, shoot it with range, and shoot it consistently. He can be a better rebounder. I think he rebounds kind of in spurts right now, but I think those are things that all can develop, as he gets into year 2 of his NBA career. I think what Golden State ultimately needs to do outside of Paschall is just they need to figure out more things from peripherally that help bolster this team. So do they believe in Damian Lee? Do they keep him around and make him a focal point of kind of what they do with things off the bench as well too? Again, we already mentioned Bowman and Chris and guys like that as well too. I'm sorry?
Dragan Bender.
Yeah, too. I mean, I think they're trying to bring him back as well and continue that reclamation project. But it's very much like and this is maybe me very much speculating, right? But I think it's a lot like when they were at the top of their game, which wasn't that long ago, and some of those veteran guys or guys are gonna have that. Hey, I want to go somewhere and win and try to prove it. I think there's gonna be a market for that for Golden State, especially if they can quote unquote guarantee guys. Hey man, you're gonna be our seventh, our eighth guy, and you'll play some major minutes. Coming in, trying to play D for us, shoot threes, etc., or play create. There's a lot of this free agent class is amazing, but I think for that type of class, the Golden State Warriors may make a lot of sense as well too, especially with money not being at a premium for most teams this year. So you look at that, I think they're going to be able to fill out some shooting, to be able to fill out some rebounding. There's a lot of bigs on the market, so they'll probably be able to add some size to this in addition to what they get in terms of a draft pick. And I think they're going to be all right next year, no matter what.
My final question for you, Shaw, and it's not so much how. I mean, I feel like it feels like ending it on a somewhat of a dud, so to speak, because there's so much you can go through here with this team. But I've really been on the fence with them trying to work with this dude, Kevin Looney. I think he's a good player, right? But I don't know how much more how much more latitude you can give this kid. I think he's a solid player. I don't think he's a starter. And he's always injured, right? His season ended because of a core injury that he suffered, just around the time frame of the pandemic, I believe. But I just begin to wonder again, like how much the emphasis is on trying to work with scrap parts in a way, with the position and a role that requires you to legitimately have someone that can be physical and that can get you key rebounds for such a high volume shooting basketball team. This is a team, Shaw, that you can make the argument being dead last in field goals made and being dead last in perimeter shooting basically is not an attribute of, them just being poor at shooting the basketball. They didn't have their core players, but at the same time, even with the guys that they had there, the opportunity to shoot was scarce and far between because they don't have people being physical to get those extra rebounds, to open up those shots for those guys. And this is going to always continually be a problem for Bob Myers. And I don't know if it's because you continue to keep resting on getting marginalized big men to come in and do what they're just physically and not capable of holding down in that front court level.
Yeah, I don't disagree when it comes to Looney at all. The injuries obviously are a big part of his inability to contribute, especially this past year. There was supposed to be a great and wide open opportunity for him to come in there and compete with Trill at that starting center position, and it just didn't materialize. But I think that's the great thing about Golden State is, quote unquote, once they're healthy again, his role or the role of even the five men in general becomes a little bit less intensive, so to speak, because they like to use a lot of small lineups anyway. But that also Luna's injury allowed Chris to develop in the way that we've already discussed. And again, I keep alluding to the fact that with this draft pick, they're probably, as long as it's high enough, they're probably going to go with the big, more than likely. And that creates all types of competition, for them at that 4 and 5 position. And maybe Looney, maybe he gets dealt. It's like, all right, hey, whatever. You battle out of training camp, and it's not something that works out. So they try to move him on, or something of that nature. Or he gets super motivated by the fact that they potentially draft the big, or Chris returning, and he comes back healthy, stronger, and gives them what they ultimately need. I think he just needs to find the way to stay healthy and keep motivated. And Golden State's going to have a plethora of options to figure out what they want to do with that 5 spot.
All right. Well, for both the Golden State Warriors and the Cleveland Cavaliers, while their records are reflective of just having an overall bad season, you can obviously point to the fact that there is some upside, some hopeful upside for one team, and definitely some woke AF upside for the Golden State Warriors going into the 2020-21 season. But we hope ultimately, for our sake, even though Shaw definitely does not want to see another Cleveland Cavaliers Warriors finals anytime soon, the fact that these guys are going to be back in the mix of things and stirring up the pot, I think will lend to feeling really good about the competitive state that the NBA will have to offer moving forward. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. And this was The Breakdown.
Coast to coast.
coast to coast.
Time to go coast to coast, discussing the news in the association. You ready to rock and roll, Mr. Shaw?
Absolutely, man. Let's ride.
See how long it's been for the both of us, man? It's like we can't even get this part out. It's been so long since we've done one of these coast to coast, man. It's just, I don't know what to tell you. Hey, the NBA and the NBPA have ratified the comeback plan, so it's a done deal. There is an intent to have basketball be played in a month's time frame.
Indeed, there is, and they've worked out all the security protocols and health procedures and all the auxiliary entertainment the players will have access to from what they won't. It's still not a perfect system. Cases are still rising in Florida and specifically in the Orange County area, but they're confident that their plan is going to be one that keeps the players ultimately safe. So we'll see what happens, man. They're going to roll them out, and we'll have NBA basketball back within a month's time. Absolutely.
All right. Also, just released, or a few days ago, 16 out of 302 players have tested positive for COVID-19. So while we talk about how the plan has been ratified, I think the fact that we've learned that 5% of the players that are expected to participate in this upcoming season, in this upcoming resurgence of a season, reopening of a season, testing positive COVID-19 might rattle the ratification of this plan.
Yeah, it's very interesting that they released those numbers, and I guess that was to try to make people feel safe about it. Obviously, the best number would be 0. I guess 16, as you alluded to, 5% isn't the end of the world. I guess it's still lower than the national average, so to speak, and that gives them the confidence to continue to move forward. As I would, like everybody else, I wonder what happens if it was a major guy like LeBron or something like that, Giannis even. I think the biggest name on that list might have been Jokic, and while that's still a big name, it's not enough for them to say, all right, we're not going to play. So we'll see, man. We'll see what ends up happening over the course of the next couple of weeks.
But this puts emphasis on why I've been bitching and moaning about me not really liking the idea that they're planning to have this reopen season in the hot spot of a state, man. Like I don't understand the logic to that. And the other thing as well too, Shaw, and listen, we're not scientists, we're not doctors, but this is a virus spreads. So even you say 16 out of 302 players test positive for COVID-19, of those 16 players, they're surrounded by 15 players on their own roster and other people who then eventually will be affected by this virus. So I think you have to look at it within that context. It would be one thing if we're saying one player gets sick and then drops, but we're saying one player gets sick and is exposed to how many other people in the period of that time being affected, and that to me is what screws up the whole thing. So again, we fall back on my position about what's going on. I'm happy that there's an intent to play, but telling me that you're going to play in an area in which the COVID-19 virus is on an uptick, to me, sounds asinine at best. All right, with that being said, Avery Bradley, Trevor Ariza, Davis Bertans, Willie Cauley-Stein, DeMarcus Cousins, what do they all have in common? They have all been very vocal and have said that they are not planning to return to any form of an NBA season, and all of them have their various concerns, but it all still centers around the COVID-19 virus.
Yeah, in general, for sure. I think with Ariza, it was very much more personal. He has some fraternity things that he's dealing with his children, and then being away and not having access to them is not great. I think Cauley-Stein having a new baby, et cetera, et cetera. So they're taking the familial issues into concern, maybe even more so than the direct threat of the illness, so to speak. Just some more very personal situations, and it also just depends on what you're. With Bradley, I think he's probably the biggest, not the biggest name, but the biggest opportunity to win an NBA championship, I think, of all the guys that are listed there. And he's just, foregoing that based on his principles, and, kudos to him for that. So I'm a little surprised there weren't more, to be honest with you. And I don't know that can necessarily change. I mean, I assume people can kind of opt out as necessary, but the vitriol for that by not doing it by the deadline will probably be a little bit worse if they decide to do that. So some interesting things going on around the NBA. I don't know if you saw Evan Fournier's response to Bertans deciding not to play, and then they ended up in a little bit of a Twitter beef as well. But everybody, like I said, to each his own. Everyone's got to do what they got to do to protect themselves.
Oh, rightly so. And listen, you're free to speak how you feel about it if you're Fournier, but I also have to respect Bertans' position and his perspective as well too. And if he's coming from a sincere place, not one that's being selfish, if he's one that's really trying to weigh all of these things into consideration, I think if you're Fournier, you should really just fall back from that and just respect the fact that this is how he feels. I think it's also going to raise a very interesting conversation that's going to be had when players are being forced to make decisions that has to weigh in their self-interest that is outside of something financial and also about the team, like when those things are in direct conflict with each other. Because when you really think about it, this is not something based on a disagreement regarding collective bargaining. This is a public health crisis. So when I hear players coming out and saying certain things that I think in a way makes it seem like they are just incoherent about the circumstances and the understanding of why other players are coming to a decision that they are against too, they should take a little bit of time, contact the player, have the talk before you start airing out your grievances through Twitter or Instagram, whatever the social media platform is, because you might wind up putting your foot in your mouth if you wind up getting caught with a virus and wind up now having to be sidelined, or your whole team being sidelined because you didn't realize what was going on. Finally, Shaw, and we're going to end this one off on a half man, half amazing note. The great, we can say that with confidence, Vince Carter. He has already indicated that he is retired, even though it was a very quiet retirement. He has decided to hang up the laces. But listen, a remarkable career by half man, half amazing, and well deserved. It sucks that we haven't been able to give him his going away party the way that we would like, but nonetheless, we will be talking about Vince Carter when we continue to move this season forward and going into the next season.
No doubt about it. I think Vince is going to be successful in anything that he sets his mind to do next. An amazing journey in an NBA career. Should be a Hall of Famer. I think what he brought to the city, and province, if you will, of Toronto and in Canada, just what he did there for those years, and then his longevity, playing in multiple teams, from New Jersey, spent some time in Phoenix, Sacramento, Memphis, Dallas. He's been all over. And concluding in Atlanta, obviously, just a pro's pro, a guy who really understood to age gracefully, never really caused a problem, so to speak. And while, his exit from Toronto wasn't as amazing as he would have liked it to be, some things seem to have been forgiven in that aspect. And I think, we're going to see his numbers and everything like that retired, in multiple places very, very soon. Absolutely.
But I think the one thing that if you are a Toronto Raptors fan, you guys are put on the map because of a dynamic player like Vince Carter. You also were benefited the opportunity to have, family tree extend right its olive branch to the likes of a Tracy McGrady, and you really got some of what the best of the NBA the United States product had to offer on display in that country. And I think Raptors fans understand that, and they appreciate that. And if not for Vince Carter, we may have had two teams moved out of that country ultimately and be relocated. So kudos to Vince Carter, man. He was a pro's pro. I may have had my opinions about him through the course of a few years, being a ball hog, selfish. You know what? You played a game of basketball, and he showed how to play the game of basketball, but he also evolved as a player, made adjustments when necessary, and especially during those years when he was playing in Orlando, he made the Orlando Magic a competitive basketball team. So, he's had his opportunities as well too. I would have loved to have seen him hoist up an O'Brien Trophy, no question. And that, I think, is the most unfortunate part about looking at a great career like Vince Carter, is that in this era of where he played, there was some opportunities there for him to probably get that. And unfortunately, him and his teams had fallen just a little short.
For me, as I've said, I think even on Twitter, my first introduction for Vince was, in high school, hearing about a young man from Daytona Beach, Maryland, a young phenom killing it. And to know that I went that year in Jackson and heard about this guy, saw his team ultimately win state championship, et cetera, et cetera. Then in North Carolina, I'm like, hey, I know that guy. I didn't really know him, but you know what I mean? It's like, I know of that guy. I felt close to Vince, for that reason. And again, I'm just excited to see how he was able to progress, and championship or no championship. I mean, I think he's one of those few guys who just kind of transcend it, so to speak. Like, you just know he's great. A lot of people love him. A lot of people look up to him, and his impact on the NBA and community has been immense. And it's not done. I said, I know he's going to still be NBA adjacent, whether he goes into broadcasting or something else. And I think he's going to be successful, as I alluded to a little bit earlier on.
I think if you're the state of Florida, you really pay attention to, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, and maybe even Amari Stoudemire. Pay attention. Those are the great basketball players that came, from Florida. Florida does not have a plethora of talented basketball players coming up out of the ranks. I think that when you have great NBA players like those guys go back into their communities, go back to their hometowns and contribute and help bring up some of those guys. We often try to profile a lot of these NBA players and coming back and coaching or maybe getting into management for, professional organizations. I equally like to see when these guys go back and are responsible for the next next phenom that's coming out. And it will be great to see how much of an influence Vince Carter and those boys help re-elevate the talent that Florida could have had, had they really respected where they were, where those guys represented and what they were doing out there. There's a lot of talented kids that don't get a lot of spotlight, get a lot of shine, and don't get a lot of intuitive coaching. A lot of them are coming up more because they're just talented. And I'm hoping that us recognizing that these three products are guys that came from Florida. We've lived in Florida, Shaw. We know how talented kids are down there, but it seems like the talent always is either in track or the talent is in football. It never really comes out in high percentages when it comes to basketball, baseball, and other kinds of sports. Tennis as well, too. But I would love to see him have an impact on those kids down there in Florida, and us talking more about a lot of Florida-based talent having an impact in the NCAA, in the G League, and ultimately in the NBA in years forward.
I think that's a great point, and I think, if he wants to do that, Florida entities, no matter what they are, we should probably welcome him with open arms. He's made great pathways through a lot of different organizations throughout his NBA career, off the court as well too, in business. And I think he's just going to have plenty of options open to him. And it would be interesting to see what he does decide and what he ultimately wants to do. But Florida definitely is in an emerging state when it comes to basketball talent. Actually, shameless plug, wrote some stories about that on Close Up 360 about a year or so ago, about how summer basketball specifically is going on a hotbed, and how that the Heat, with their great runs, inspired basketball here and tried to transform Florida from a football to a basketball state a little bit. But I think Vince is definitely an originator of that, being from the area, and being able to maybe give back in some way will be a great opportunity for the state itself.
Absolutely. This has been an excellent show altogether, Shaw. Once again, just putting together some really, really quality points about, what we're looking forward to seeing with some of these teams, and more importantly, where the NBA is going to be trending, hopefully on the opposite side. I know, things are going to be moving fast come this next month. But needless to say, man, we got to cover these other little items, man. They seem to have an important impact when we talk about the NBA in months ahead.
It's all relevant, right? It's all relative and relevant. And I think for us, we want to make sure that we stay on top of all of those things, and make sure our fans and listeners enjoy and can stay on top of those things as well too. So it is our job. It's what we have chosen to do, and we're going to continue to do it to the best of our ability. In months now unfold, an NBA season also tries to resume, in late July. So we'll be here for the ride, and it's going to be a long and an interesting one throughout the next over the course of the next couple of months. So I'm excited to do it, and as with you, my dude, it's always a pleasure, and I'm sure all of our fans and listeners are enjoying the content as well, man.
Absolutely. Once again, we'd like to thank you and yours for hopping on board with us. Thanks for tuning in as we continue to bury those bodies over the next few weeks with our coveted autopsy reports. For the Baseline, Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. We do, and we'll catch up with you next time.